Okay, hopefully I'll be talking louder this time. I got the message that my last one was too quiet and you could hear my dogs in the background. So I will speak up, but there's a possibility my dogs might see something and begin to howl or hear something or something like that, but we'll try and keep them quiet and see if I can't talk a little bit louder now. We just went through a whole bevy of taxes, didn't we, in which it adds up. Believe me, it adds up. You'll see that when you're paying all the bills. And even with all those taxes, both direct and indirect, we don't bring in enough money. We have to borrow money at every level, including the federal. We're only going to talk about the federal level today, but most states are in severe tax deficits as well. We're going to talk about the U.S. debt. And by the way, this embedding process doesn't allow me to show the video, but this U.S. debt clock you should try and check out sometime. I know you've seen some of them before, but it's radical in its display of how much money we're borrowing by the second. It's stunning, really. So the power to borrow. The framers knew that there might be times in which reasonable people would need to borrow money, just like in our own families. When you get older, this will hopefully be the way you are, is that you borrow money when you need to. There's times when we're out of work, or we need this, or we need that. Most of us have houses that we initially borrow to buy. We don't pay cash for our houses and our cars. So there's nothing wrong with borrowing money as long as you pay it back. And we would imagine if the framers intended that, we'd be able to borrow money and we'd be like enlightened, responsible people back. And because of that, it's unlimited by the Constitution. Theoretically, constitutionally, we could go as high as we possibly could sustain systemically and economically. And we're pretty close to that. You know, different economics gurus do different things with different numbers to where that blow up number is and when that number will come. But you can't just continue to have the debt climb and climb and climb without really startlingly debilitating economic problems, and that's probably going to come sometime when you're out of college, probably making some pretty decent money, about ready to get the good promotions and stuff. And you're going to have to solve it and require some additional taxes and stuff. Can I just say, for my generation, the baby boomers, thank you very much. Now, the framers' ideas, again, as I just said, hey, let's borrow when we need to, pay it back. Now, who do we owe it to? Lots of people understand, and the first thing is we owe it to China, we owe it to this guy, we owe it to that country, we owe it to this country. And true, we do owe a certain amount of it to our foreign countries. But the main people we owe it to is to ourselves. When I mean by ourselves, it's mostly middle-class people who own securities, put them their entire lives, just like I have, to fund my retirement, my children's educations, and the like, in which we buy securities, treasury bonds, treasury bills, or you're in funds that buy those particular securities backed by the government. Absolutely have to be there for the confidence of the American people to keep buying them, to keep paying for things. And for the most part, that's who you owe. So when I say that eventually when things come to bear, when we have to pay the bill, I mean, we really are, because although we could go bankrupt, you'll see it is a constitutional power by Congress. We ain't going to do that, because you'll be owing people like me that. And if I ever go out to I think I might have said this before, but if I ever go out to the mailbox, find out that a little piece of paper in there from the millennials like you guys saying, hey, we ain't paying. Sorry. Well, that's the day that I didn't go to the Garland Gun Club and begin to learn how to shoot a gun. And me and my other old baby boomer pals, you just said you weren't going to pay. We're heading up to D.C. to take the country back. So I suggest you get a bulletproof vest. If you do that. But you're not going to, because you owe ourselves. We can't do that to each other. We owe ourselves. Now, this isn't a very sexy problem, constitutionally sexy, but it is a very important one. You may remember the Articles of Confederation were needed because the states did not get along. And that not getting along was not in petty, well, actually some began in petty ways, but did not realize themselves in petty ways, but economic ways. States began to tariff each other, use their own money, insist on this, insist on that, basically just not getting along with each other, right? And so the federal government regulates trade. All right? They regulate tariffs, product inspection, quotas, imports, exports, all that stuff, all economic policy between us and foreign countries are done by the federal government. So as much as Texas would like to have a certain product, probably trade and product treaties with Mexico or somebody else, not allowed. The federal government can make regional differences. That can happen. It's not incredibly likely, but at times treaties can treat certain states differently in terms of their trade regulations with other countries. But that is not done by the state with a foreign country, and it's certainly not done within states with other states. The federal government regulates the trade between the states and between the states and foreign countries. So no entering into agreements with other nations. The framers thought that the states might get selfish, and I don't know about you, but I would tend to agree. It is what would happen. Now, when we get into some of these other powers we're about to get into, we have to remember that the checks and balances tells us this. And part of what Congress is there to do is to keep the other two sides from getting out of power. So some of the other powers they have are not anything more than they're not proactive powers. They're reactive powers, trying to keep the other two branches from getting out of control, right? And so the rest of our balance, I believe, is going to be looking, well, there's a couple other ones, but most of it's going to be looking as what powers does the legislative branch, does Congress have to control the president and control the judicial branch, the courts. So let's look at a couple of those, can we? First of all, we've seen, and again, some of this stuff should begin to wrap up around each other here at the end of the semester. We've already seen some of these things come into play. When we studied the courts, we knew that we've already seen that the Senate confirms the judges, not the House. The House has nothing to do with the president. Remember, appoints the judge, and the Senate confirms. And those are bloody battles, to say the least, because they're political, they're bloody. Not just the Supreme Court justices, the judges use the lower courts, especially the 186 judges below them, the ones that come up for appointment. They use that, the party out of power in the Senate, to really hold over the head of the president. So whenever we have a president of one party, he's always being held up by the Senate in confirmation of another, the judges he appoints. And the reason that is even if we have right now, we have a Democratic president, right? We have a Democratic Senate, but it takes 60 senators to confirm a justice. And so if you only have 58, like they have right now, they can maybe get 58 votes to break filibusters. That ain't enough. And so for that reason, we have a lot of lower court judges that are stalled. They've been appointed by the president, but nothing has happened in the Senate. And believe me, that happens on both sides. I didn't put up a chart for you, but look at them. It's really stunning. And only political, the appointees of judges that presidents make early on that have not ever been confirmed in the Senate. So it's quite startling. I think when we speak in person next time, I'll have something to show you what I mean. They can also add the lower courts. So in other words, we saw the 11 courts that were appellate courts underneath the Supreme Court. Remember those that are done geographically. When the country gets bigger and bigger, as it has, it can add a court. And when it add a court, it usually disperses the amount of people in the other one, so they'll have to redraw out the geographic lines. So they can't add a Supreme Court, but they can't add lower courts. What they can do to the Supreme Court, and never have, to determine the number of justices on the court. So right now there are 9 on the Supreme Court, but they could make that any number they wanted. If that be the case, I kind of doubt that will ever happen. All right, so how does Congress control the President of the United States, his executive powers? Well, first and foremost, hasn't happened yet, but he can impeach the president. Impeach and convict, that is, remove from office. Twice we've had the president impeached, and we're going to talk about the process in just a second. So we've had 2 presidents impeached by the House, but not convicted by the Senate. Bill Clinton over the Monica Lewinsky affair in 1998, and Andrew Johnson after Lincoln was assassinated a couple years after he became president. And both times the House brought the 2 presidents up on charges. Now, if you remember, it's akin to the grand jury. Remember the grand jury in due process? Brings up the person on charges, said, yes, we will have a trial. That person, there's enough evidence that we need to have a trial. We're not saying you're guilty, but we are going to have a trial. So the House is kind of like the grand jury. It brings the president up on charges, or justices. And I'm not going to say that's easy, because it isn't easy, and it can be highly political, like both of these certainly were. But it's easier to bring them up on charges, obviously. The hard part is the conviction, right? Both times he was brought up, the Senate held a trial. It is held by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In this case, this was Chief Rehnquist, who presided over the trial, Bill Clinton. Marvelous stuff. Those of my age or younger, the generation that was around then, could watch television. I mean, in government class, we basically watched, for a couple of weeks, every day we watched the trial. Up a little table in the corner, we watched the President of the United States being on trial for his presidency. So it was pretty riveting stuff back before the days of YouTube, when you had to tune in live to this stuff to see it, or clips of it later. You can just bring it up on command. So it was quite startling to see what was happening, and hadn't happened in the previous 130 years or so since Johnson was impeached. Now, what were they impeached for? Well, this constitutional burden is for high crimes, and they do not say what high crimes means. So it's often with the Constitution, as we've seen, you and I, it's frustratingly broad and unclear. So what high crimes mean isn't spelled out in the Constitution. It really hasn't even been spelled out in Supreme Court law either. It depends on what the Senate thinks it is. Well, what the House thinks high crimes are for bringing them up on, and what the Senate thinks high crimes are credible enough for removal from office. Both times the House thought that the president should be tried for high crimes, that there was sufficient evidence that perhaps there was something there. Each time the Senate failed to find the burden. You may remember enough about, or you may know enough about Clinton. He was brought up for perjury charges. Ultimately, the Senate decided that he perjured, lying about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, and that, right or wrong, did not rise to their definition of high crimes. Perjury certainly sounds to me like it's a high crime, but when you think about perjury over what, I suppose there are, and leave that up to you, of course, there are certain times, I guess, you rely under oath that perhaps aren't as bad as other times. I know it sounds really bad, but I guess when you're talking about when the Constitution has separated it into high crimes, it would seem as if the framers wanted you to make some distinctions. I don't know that. That's a constitutional argument that you can make either way. Andrew Johnson, if you know your history, was impeached almost totally for political reasons. For the radical Republicans did not believe he was being tough enough on the South. He really was just following what Abraham Lincoln wanted him to do, and that was to try and bring the South back into the fold of the nation and try and heal. He continued that policy, and the radical Republicans would have none of it. Tried to remove him. Now, of course, they didn't bring him up for that. You have to have a reason, and they brought that reason was, I believe he had fired the Undersecretary of the Navy or some such. And when we get to the presidential powers here, next unit, you'll see that the president can appoint people like the Undersecretary of Navy, Secretary of State, but actually removing him against his will is not in the Constitution, and it's still foggy about whether or not the president has that right, which seems a little goofy. You could appoint but not fire. And at any rate, in 1868, about when Johnson was impeached, that was the charge they used, that he had he had fired the Undersecretary of State, and because of that, they brought him up on charges. And by one vote, I'm sorry, I don't know the person's name, it was a senator from Vermont, I believe, maybe New Jersey. By one vote, one senator only, Mr. Johnson was acquitted, because I firmly believe that if the Senate had convicted Mr. Johnson, President Johnson, on these charges that were really nothing more, and everybody knew it, political in nature, highly political in nature, completely political in nature, the radical Republicans not wanting to wait until the next election to remove him. That's why he was impeached, and within one lone senator had his presidency almost removed right out from under him. So good for that senator who I think showed some clarity in really what the framers were thinking. High crimes, probably, we don't know what they meant by high crimes, but I bet they didn't mean it was because you didn't like what the president's policies were. That's what elections are for, they would probably say. And we probably would have been proud of this one senator. So we'll move on to the rest of the executive powers and the rest of the powers of Congress here next presentation.